Today, you're going to learn everything you need to know about React components here. And I've created this kind of web page here, and we're both going to use it as like code examples, as well as topics we're going to cover and kind of organize things. So first, we're going to cover what you should know before diving into components. Then we're going to cover what they are. I'm going to show you an example. We're going to discuss why components might be a good idea when developing web pages, how to create components, nesting components, as well as organizing components. So first off, for prerequisites, I think it would definitely be a good idea to understand JavaScript functions, and then also have a rough idea of what JSX is. If you don't know JSX, then I have my previous React video. I think it's like something like the truth about JSX or something like that. That will be a good kind of starting place to understand that. And then also understanding JavaScript functions, because if you understand these, then components are pretty straightforward and fairly easy to understand. So we will mark that as done. But what are components? Well, components are effectively just JavaScript functions that start with a capital letter. So that's an important distinction there. When creating a component in React, you should make sure that that component starts with a capital letter. I'll show you this in our example here in a sec. And then these components, well, they return JSX. And JSX gets converted into HTML and injected into the web page or the DOM. So it ends up being just kind of part of your UI. So when looking at even my web page here, these little like drop-down menus, these are themselves little components of UI. And for every drop-down, I'm just reusing these components. So these components are just JavaScript functions starting with a capital letter that return pieces of UI. So for another example of kind of what this looks like, and that's what we're going to cover now, so I'm going to mark that as done, and we're going to move on to this example. We're going to go to /UI components and look at some examples here. So I've created just several examples of different common components. So here we have a button component to where we could reuse this all across our application. And then when I click on the button component, I get an alert saying button was clicked. And then we could reuse this in several other areas. I could reuse this same button for a submit button down here, or for this modal component here. We could kind of reuse this component or this piece of UI, this JavaScript function that returns UI, all throughout our application. This card right here that has this kind of shaded background, a card title, as well as card content, well, this is a component that we could use in several places of our application. This is a separate JavaScript function that returns UI. Same thing with this form component. It is its own JavaScript function here that returns a name and an email field, as well as a submit button. Same thing with this modal component. It is a JavaScript function, and I'll show you the code in a sec, that kind of does this logic for opening and closing a modal. And same thing with this nav bar here. So let's go over to VS Code, and you're going to see this is technically a Next.js application, but we're still just writing React here. You don't need to know any Next.js for this. But I have a components folder in which I've just created several different components. So if we look at the button component, what you're going to see is that this is just a JavaScript function here. It starts with a capital letter, and then I'm assigning this const button to an anonymous function. And what it does is it has a little bit of logic here within the body of the function, and then it returns some JSX, which then gets converted to HTML. And then I use some Tailwind CSS to style it. And this is our logic for when they click on the button. This represents a component. We look at the card component, very similar thing. It is a function, so const card is equal to an anonymous function, and then the return for this function just returns some JSX. And Like this is where it would come in handy to understand JSX and some of the rules of JSX, but it's just returning this piece of UI. And then we can use this and reuse this in several places. Now, my next video is going to cover props and passing arguments effectively to these components so I can customize this. So I could effectively take a title and content props, and then we could use those props right here for the title and then right here for the content, or we could take these arguments here and use those so we can customize these components, but we'll cover that in the next video. Just know that that's something that you can definitely do in components. They don't need to be these like self-contained, isolated components here. They can definitely be customized more. And then for the form component, you see this time around, it does a little bit more. It uses some state within the form as well as a handle submit function, but the basic principles still apply. It is a JavaScript function here, and eventually it returns some JSX, which then gets converted to HTML, and then it does a little bit of logic here. Same thing with the modal component. It is just a function that returns some JSX. And then same thing with the nav component and so on and so forth. So all these components are just JavaScript functions that return a piece of your UI. So heading back here, we go back to my home page. I definitely should have saved these in local storage, but we're going to remark these as done. But why components? I've mentioned a little bit, but it allows you to combine your markup, which is your HTML, your CSS, so your styles, and your JavaScript into custom reusable UI elements for your app, which some people don't really like, kind of combining all of your HTML and CSS and JavaScript. But I think once you get used to the pattern, it really is kind of nice, because when we look at this, everything that we need for this component is right here within this file. We could add some logic here, so some JavaScript here in the body of this function, which say in our modal component, we do that. So we have our JavaScript logic here, and then we return our markup here, which is our JSX. So a button, some divs, an H2, a P tag. So we have our markup, and then we also have our styles. So we have our Tailwind CSS class names. And all this can be found right within this component. And I don't necessarily need to create like a separate HTML page and a separate CSS page and do what you might have to do if you're just using like vanilla JavaScript. Everything I need is right here within this component. And then I can use this component anywhere that I want to within my application. So I can get some really nice reusability of these components. And then, as we'll cover in my next video, you can pass arguments to these components, because at the end of the day, they're just JavaScript functions, so they're capable of accepting arguments just like normal functions, but they can take these arguments and then you can customize these components even further. So they have the benefit of kind of allowing you to combine your markup, your styles, as well as your JavaScript into custom reusable UI elements, and then you can just reuse those elements throughout your application. And it really does help just focusing on one piece of like UI at a time, because, you know, it can be a little daunting. So if we come back to, you know, UI components, if I need to create like a big web page with, you know, a form, different card elements, different, you know, sidebars and, you know, a navigation menu and all this stuff, it can be like, I don't even know where to start. But if you're like, okay, I'm just going to focus on creating one component at a time. I'm going to first just focus on creating the form, and then I'll create that component and render that to the page. And then after that, I'm going to focus on creating a card, and you focus on that, create it exactly like you want to, and then kind of move forward with your web page. And then if I want to, I can reuse those components elsewhere in my application, which we'll kind of get to now. So we'll go back to the home page. I'll remark these as done. So we covered why components, but now how do you kind of create components? Well, first, we need to define the function. So let's go to the button here. So first we define the function. So const button is equal to an anonymous function. Other things that you can do is you can do a function declaration. So you could do function button, and then you could create your component like this and return your JSX. That's totally fine to do as well. Basically, any way you create JavaScript functions, you can do that here. I think it's pretty standard to see components created like this with anonymous arrow functions from JavaScript. But for the sake of readability, I actually kind of like the syntax of just saying function declaration and then the button. I actually quite like that. But you're going to often see kind of I guess this would be considered maybe the modern way of doing it, of just doing a anonymous function and assigning that to a constant like so to create your functions. So first you need some sort of function definition, and ignore this use client. That's a Next.js specific thing that you don't need to worry about. But first you define the function. Then you can add some logic and return your JSX. So here you can see we have a little bit of logic here. So we have a handle click. And if we go to our modal, you can see we have a handle close, and kind of we're handling some React state here. And same thing with a form. We have some logic here, but across all these, you'll see we have our kind of function definition, potentially some logic depending on what you want to do with your component. And then we return some JSX. Same thing with a modal. Function definition, some logic, and then return some JSX. And then finally, you can export and import your components. So we'll cover organizing components here in a second. But what you're going to see is that all these have like an export default modal. And then we export default form. And then we export default section. And then we export default card. So we're exporting all these components because we need to do that to be able to use those components within other like pages. So if we go to our page.jsx, you can see for our UI components page, we are importing our button component, our card, our form. So since we've exported these, we can import these all within separate files, and then we can render those within our separate pages. Now, to render these components, we kind of use the JSX syntax. So to render our card component, we render it like a self-containing HTML element. Now, you don't necessarily need to do this because you can see our section component. We actually render it as a parent to the card component, but we'll cover that in just my next thing. But just to stay on importing and exporting once a little bit more, in order to use these components, our button, our card, our form, our modal, we need to make sure to export to them from this file. It's very common to export default to them. So what that basically means is that here within this, we don't need to say like import modal from this components page. The default export is modal, so we can just say import modal from that components folder. Now, if I don't export modal, so if I comment this out, what we're going to see, and I try to go to our UI components page here, they were unable to resolve something. And basically what's happening is that we're trying to import here in UI components, we're trying to import a modal component from our modal file that isn't there. So if I go back to modal and I comment this back in and we make sure to export it, we can now use that within other files. And the way that you can import it is I don't need to import like with curly braces here if it's an export default. If it was just if I go back to modal, if I just do export modal and I export it like so, then I need to import it with curly braces as well. I need to import modal from components modal. And if you see nothing breaks here, everything still works. But I just import it from the relative path in my project. So components modal. But it's probably more common here to see a default export. So export, default modal, and then coming back to my page, I don't need these curly braces anymore. I can just import modal from components modal, and all this will work. All right, so in order to use your components, you need to make sure to import and export them correctly, which is honestly more of a JavaScript thing than a React thing. But coming back here, we've covered prerequisites, what are components, examples, why components, and how to create components. But now let's go to nesting components. So it is perfectly fine to nest components within other components just like HTML. So if we come to this UI components page, you can see that within each section component, so I have my section component here, and we'll cover props in my next video as well as children. You can see that I don't render it like a self-containing element like I do with a button, the card, the form, the modal. To render these components to the page, I render them like an HTML element with opening and closing tags. So you render them just like you render other kind of JSX within your project. Your components are effectively custom elements. So you render them to the page like you render other elements, like an H2 element or a HTML form element or an input element. Your components, they're JavaScript functions that return JSX, and you render them to your web page just like you do other elements in HTML. So the way I render this button component is here in my components page, I do an opening bracket button and then a closing, a self-closing element here. Now, like I said, you don't necessarily need to render them like this. If I wanted to render something as a child of this button element, I could. I could render, a card as a child to my button element. So if you need to render a button as a parent to a card, you can definitely do that like this. Now, I'll cover how exactly to do that in my next video on props, but just know that it's totally fine to nest your components exactly how you nest HTML. It's really not that much different. But just remember that when I want to effectively call my component, because it's a JavaScript function, you render it on your page like this. So once this UI components function here, once this gets rendered to the page, it's going to kind of go down our page here, and it's going to see, okay, we have a navbar component. I'm going to call the navbar function and then return this JSX, which gets converted to HTML. And then once it gets to the section component, it's going to call this section component here and then return this JSX. Same thing. Once it gets to this button component, it's going to effectively call our button function and then return this JSX. And when it hits this form element, it's going to call our form component and then return the JSX that's within this form. So it's going to get rendered out here within this section. And we'll do a little recap here towards the end. But it's perfectly fine to nest your components within other components. That's totally valid to do. Now, finally, when it comes to organizing components, multiple components can exist in the same file, but a common practice is one component per file. So as you can see here within my components page, in my button file, I just have one singular button component. But if I wanted to, I could create a function card, and I could create a card component here that just say returns a p tag, and then it has some content. And then I could use that card within my button component somewhere. So I could render like my card component here within my button. And that would be fine to do. The reason I get an error is because in JSX, you need to return just one outer element, but I cover that more in my JSX video. But this is fine to do. So I create this card component right here, and then I render this within this button component, and both of these are in the same file. And if I wanted to, I could export button as well as card from this file. And then I could import those in other files, and that would be fine to do. So you can create components in the same file, but generally, I prefer to kind of keep one component per file. Sometimes it's actually really reasonable to create multiple components in the same file, because sometimes you create like one main component in a file, but that main component gets pretty long, and you realize that it would actually make sense to create like an outside component that you just reuse within that singular main component. And you're not really going to be using that outer component anywhere else within your application. In that case, it would probably make sense to just kind of co-locate that or isolate that to that single file and create multiple components to that file. So just know, as a rule of thumb, you're probably going to see like one component per file. But if you have like a longer main component, it's perfectly fine to split that component into multiple components in the same file and just export kind of one main component. Or sometimes it might make sense to export multiple components in the same file. So that's perfectly okay to do. I just think it's probably a little bit more common to see kind of one component per file. So that covers kind of the essentials of what you need to know about components in React. But let's kind of do a little bit of a recap here. So components, well, they are JavaScript functions that start with a capital letter and return JSX, which is going to effectively return little kind of components of your web page or little pieces of UI. So as we can see, this button, it is just a JavaScript function that returns some JSX here. I'm going to clean this up a little bit, but just a JavaScript function that returns JSX. And the way that you then call this function is by rendering it on your web page like you would an HTML element. But they can all be like self-closing HTML elements. So like, here's my button, here's my card. They're all like self-closing HTML elements. And this effectively, once my browser starts rendering this component, once it hits button and section and card and form, it's going to call those components, and then it's going to generate the HTML that these components return. And then why are components useful? Well, it allows you to combine your markup, your CSS, as well as your JavaScript, all into custom, reusable UI elements, so you could just reuse those throughout your entire application. And it really can help kind of speeding up development and isolating kind of the logic for certain sections of your app. Now you create components by defining a JavaScript function, adding some logic and returning JSX, and then exporting and importing that component. So we define our JavaScript function, we have a little bit of logic, we return this JSX, and then we export this component and then import it into other files, and we render that component to the page by using like HTML syntax, like JSX syntax, rendering it like an element as a self-contained element, and that effectively calls that JavaScript function, and it will return whatever that JavaScript function returns. So some JSX. And then it's also perfectly fine to nest your components and have like parent-child relationships, like we see here with this section being a parent of this button element. That is perfectly fine to do. And then when it comes to organizing your components, you can have multiple components in the same file, but you're probably going to see one component per file as maybe a little bit more of the standard. But if you have a longer kind of main component, you might see that component exported as the default export, and then kind of the pieces of that main component split out into other smaller components in that same file. It is still pretty common to see, and it's totally fine to do. So that, my friends, is components in React. Let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything I missed here, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in that next one.